The chamber is heavy with silence, broken only by the rasp of a man's breath struggling against the weight of his own body. The air is foul, poisoned with the cloying sweetness of decay, a stench so thick it seeps into your clothes, your skin, your very lungs. Shadows cling to the walls, drawn by the flicker of candlelight, but they do not hide what lies before you. Upon the bed sprawls a figure bloated and broken, his flesh split open in weeping sores that spill pus and blood onto sheets once fit for a king. The sound of it, the slow drip of fluid, the crackle of cloth stiffened with rot, is unbearable. You cannot look away. His legs, swollen to grotesque proportions, pulse with infection. The skin is stretched thin, discolored, as if at any moment it might burst. The body exhales the odor of something already half in the grave. Servants recoil, gagging behind perfumed cloths, yet bound by duty they return again and again to strip away soiled linens that must be burned before the dawn. The air itself seems to tremble with the enormity of what you are witnessing. This is not some nameless wretch abandoned to misery in a gutter. This is Henry Tudor, once the Lion of England, a king who defied popes, crushed kingdoms, and sent queens to their deaths with the flick of a hand. He had been worshipped, feared, obeyed without question. Now, he is a prisoner of his own rotting flesh, trapped in a body that has turned traitor. The throne beneath him, the crown above him, the power that once bent all of Europe to his will, none of it matters here. In this room, in this moment, you see the truth. Even the mightiest of kings cannot command the mercy of his own failing body. No crown shields him from the cruelty of decay. What you are seeing is not myth, nor some grotesque parable conjured to frighten children. This is history, written in the flesh and blood of England's most infamous monarch. Henry VIII, the man who once shaped nations with his appetite for power, now rots within his own palace, his grandeur drowned beneath the stench of his decaying body. No legend could capture the reality of these final days, for the truth itself is darker, more brutal, and more damning than any tale whispered through the centuries. This is the hidden face of Tudor England, the shadow that lurks behind the gilded portraits and triumphant anthems. The age that gave us dazzling courts, glittering banquets, and the power of empire was also an age of cruelty, fear, and flesh turned against itself. Behind the painted smile of the Renaissance king lies a body in revolt, a mind unraveling, and a court forced to endure the unbearable presence of their sovereign as he slipped closer to the grave. Tonight we walk that path, not in the softened words of textbooks, but in the raw, unfiltered truth. You will see Henry not as the glorious monarch immortalized in history, but as he truly was at the end, swollen, paranoid, abandoned, and haunted. You will smell the rot that drove courtiers from his chamber. You will hear the rage that terrorized servants who no longer bowed out of loyalty, but out of fear for their own lives. And you will come to understand how the throne itself, the very seat of his power, became the prison that trapped him in agony. If you think history should be told in its raw, unfiltered truth, hit subscribe. If you don't, at least tell us in the comments why you'd rather keep history sugar-coated. Before the rot, before the madness, before the throne became his coffin, there was another Henry. You see him not in the shadows of a sick room, but in the blaze of youth, a prince whose very presence dazzled Europe. He was tall, over 6 feet in an age when most men stood far shorter. His shoulders broad, his frame lithe, his face radiant with the confidence of one born to rule. The court sang of his beauty. Poets compared him to Apollo, and foreign envoys marveled at the athletic vigor that marked him as the very image of Renaissance power. When his father, Henry VII, left this world, England exhaled in relief. The old king had been cautious, miserly, a man who clutched coin and crown with equal suspicion. But his son was different. Where the father hoarded, the son lavished. Where the father counted every step, the son leapt into glory. England had dreamed of a monarch who would embody magnificence, and in young Henry VIII, they believed they had found him. You watch him in his prime, a horse thundering beneath him in the lists, his lance lowered with perfect poise, his laughter ringing across banquet halls heavy with roasted meats and spiced wine, his voice soaring in hymns he himself composed. For he fancied not only sport, but music, poetry, and learning. He was everything his father was not: bold, generous, reckless, and adored. And yet, in that very recklessness, the seeds of his ruin had already been sown. For the prince who hurled himself into tournaments with a hunger for danger was the same man whose body would one day betray him. The young monarch who gorged himself at endless feasts, consuming more in one sitting than his subjects might see in a week, was already feeding the sickness that would one day consume him. His restless ambition, the need not just to rule but to conquer, to possess, to dominate, would one day isolate him, turning allies into enemies and family into strangers. The Golden Prince, who seemed to promise England a new dawn, was, even then, walking unknowingly toward the night. Most who watch will turn away here, content to remember only the golden youth and not the monstrous end. But if you want the truth in its fullness, the light and the dark, then you belong with us. Subscribe to Cave Tales Ancient History. If you will not, then speak in the comments and tell us why you'd rather keep to illusions than face the raw reality of the past. The golden promise of youth did not last. With the crown secure upon his head, Henry surrendered himself to appetites that seemed as boundless as his ambition. Day after day, tables groaned under the weight of roasted swans, venison, whole sides of beef, pies stuffed with eels, and pastries glistening with sugar imported at great cost. Tankards of ale and goblets of deep red wine followed, chased by sweetmeats and spiced delicacies meant for no stomach but a king's. It was said he consumed more than 5,000 calories in a single day, a feast that might have sustained entire families while he alone devoured it without restraint. At first, it seemed harmless indulgence, the natural reward of a monarch who could command the world to his table. But excess leaves its mark. His frame, once powerful and lean, began to thicken. The vibrant prince grew heavy, his movements slower, his breaths shorter. Headaches came like storms, splitting his skull until he clawed at his temples in desperation. Ulcers festered in his legs and stomach, while migraines left him shrieking in pain that no court physician dared diagnose honestly. And with the physical torment came something darker, an ungovernable rage. Once a man of wit and charm, Henry began to explode without warning, overturning tables, hurling goblets, condemning servants with a word. Courtiers learned to tread lightly, for a glance, a poorly chosen phrase. Even a moment's hesitation could provoke a fury that ended in ruin. Politics itself began to shift under the weight of his temper. Decisions were made not in calm deliberation, but in terror of the king's wrath, as if the state itself was dragged into the chaos of his body's decline. Most will just enjoy this story and scroll away. But if you're someone who believes this channel deserves to keep uncovering history's ugliest truths, prove it by subscribing. If not, at least admit in the comments why you won't support real history. It was in January of 1536 that the Golden Prince's body betrayed him fully. At a tournament meant to display his strength and glory, Henry mounted his horse, armored and resplendent, eager once more to prove he was still the warrior king of his youth. But when the lance shattered and the horse beneath him buckled, the king was thrown violently to the ground. He lay there unmoving, unconscious for more than 2 hours, as panic rippled through the crowd. For those long moments, England hovered on the brink of chaos, for it seemed its monarch was already dead. When Henry awoke, he carried more than bruises. His leg had been shattered and torn, the flesh gouged in ways no physician of the age could master. What should have healed with time instead festered. A wound that never closed, never stopped weeping blood and pus, became the doorway through which misery entered his life and never departed. Each step was agony, each attempt to ride a horse a reminder that he was no longer the invincible figure of his youth. The doctors tried everything their limited knowledge allowed. They pressed herbs into the wound, praying nature would draw out corruption. They seared the flesh with red-hot irons, believing fire might cauterize the sickness. They even inserted thin gold tubes, desperate to drain the endless seep of fluid. Yet nothing worked. The infection lingered, gnawing at the bone, swelling the leg to grotesque proportions. What began as a fall in a tournament ring became a lifelong curse, a festering reminder that the king who had once seemed untouchable was, after all, made of fragile flesh. From that day forward, Henry VIII was never the same. His body slowed, his pain sharpened, and the shadow of death began to follow him wherever he went. The jousting field that had once echoed with cheers became the silent stage of his undoing, the moment where the Lion of England first felt his cage begin to close. The wound never closed. It deepened, widened, and blackened, a living chasm in the flesh of a king. Each day it wept a foul mixture of pus and blood, soaking through layers of cloth, staining the floors, and announcing its presence before the man himself ever entered a room. The odor was suffocating, a thick, sickly sweetness laced with rot that clung to walls, curtains, and clothing. It was said that even before Henry appeared, one could know he was nearby the stench of his own body decaying from within. Gangrene crept across the leg, skin turning dark and brittle as though the flesh itself had turned to leather. Swelling grew so severe that special chairs had to be built to hold him, and his once proud suits of armor could no longer be worn. What had once been a warrior's limb was now a grotesque burden, swollen, infected, and poisoning the rest of his body with every passing hour. Courtiers, bound by duty, forced themselves into his chambers, though many pressed perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces to blunt the assault on their senses. Some failed even that. Records speak of men and women stumbling from his presence pale and retching, unable to withstand the reality of their monarch's decline. Bedding and clothes, once symbols of wealth and magnificence, were stripped daily, soaked as they were with fluid and rot, and consigned to the flames to keep disease from spreading. The man who had once bent a continent to his will was reduced to something scarcely human. The proud king who strode through palaces with a booming laugh and a commanding glare now sat hunched, foul-smelling, and crippled, a walking corpse who ruled not with majesty, but with horror. The crown upon his head gleamed no less brightly, yet beneath it sat a body collapsing into ruin, reminding all who saw him that power cannot mask the corruption of flesh. We're taking you deeper into the rot of Tudor history than most channels dare. If you think this deserves more light, subscribe. If not, tell us in the comments why you'd rather just watch polished lies. As the body collapsed, the mind soon followed. Pain gnawed at Henry without pause, turning each day into a torment that no crown could soften. Sleep came in broken fragments, shattered by throbbing agony from his leg, and in those sleepless hours, shadows began to twist into enemies. He became convinced that poison stalked him at every turn. Every cup of wine, every platter of meat, every spoonful of medicine was suspect. Food tasters were forced to prove their loyalty with every meal, yet even then he eyed them with suspicion, certain that treachery lurked in the very bread he ate. His paranoia spilled outward. Servants who hesitated, who stammered, who failed to please him in the smallest detail, found themselves accused of betrayal. Some were dragged away in terror, their loyalty answered with imprisonment or death. Physicians, summoned to soothe his suffering, found themselves trembling before the very man they tried to heal. If their remedies failed, as they always did, suspicion sharpened to fury. Men who once walked proudly as royal doctors vanished into silence, their absence never explained, their fates whispered about in fear. The fury came without warning. One moment, Henry sat silent, slumped in his chair, groaning with pain. The next, he would erupt in violence, hurling goblets across the chamber, striking tables with his fists, shouting death warrants at shadows no one else could see. His face twisted into something monstrous, his eyes wild with a terror that could not be reasoned away. Worst of all, suspicion crept into the very heart of his family. He looked upon his children not with a father's love, but with a tyrant's doubt. He saw in their youth and health a cruel reminder of what he had lost, and in their ambitions a threat to his own fading grasp on power. Even blood offered no comfort. his paranoia, spared no one. The silence around the king grew heavier with each passing month. Once, his chambers had been alive with music, laughter, and the soft murmur of courtiers eager to flatter him. Now, the corridors outside his rooms were deserted, echoing only with the shuffle of servants too frightened to linger. To be near Henry was to endure the foul air that clung to him, the unpredictable violence of his temper, the possibility of sudden ruin. Even those who had built their fortunes on his favor now prayed for excuses to remain away from his side. His children, too, were carefully kept at a distance. To parade their youth and vigor before him was to invite his bitterness. They were symbols of renewal, of life and future, while he rotted in place, chained to a body that had become his tormentor. He could not bear the sight of them for long. They were brought in only when duty demanded it, their time with him reduced to brief, careful encounters under watchful eyes. For them, their father was no longer a figure of protection or majesty, but a looming shadow of pain and suspicion. And so, the king lived in a prison of his own making. Surrounded by guards, confined by ceremony, he was left to face his agony in solitude. He stared into mirrors and saw not the golden prince of his youth, but a bloated caricature of what power had made him. His crown, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a mockery. It had lifted him above every other man, but it had also cut him off from comfort, honesty, and love. The absolute authority that once seemed divine now ensured only that no one dared tell him the truth. No one dared soothe him. No one dared be human in his presence. Imagine building a community that dares to tell these forgotten stories. That's what Cave Tales Ancient History is about. If you'd walk away from this without subscribing, at least confess in the comments why you don't want this work to continue. By the winter of 1547, the transformation was complete. The once golden prince was gone, replaced by a swollen giant, barely recognizable as human. His weight had climbed to nearly 300 pounds, his body distorted and deformed by years of unchecked excess and festering disease. His face, once admired for its vigor and strength, was now puffed and distorted, his eyes narrowed to slits by the swelling of his flesh. Abscesses opened across his body, weeping foul discharge that no physician could contain. The sheets beneath him, soaked nightly with pus and blood, were stripped and burned each morning, yet the smell of decay never left his chamber. The King of England lay drowning in his own corruption. Each movement brought waves of agony, each breath a reminder of how far he had fallen. Courtiers whispered that death itself seemed to hover in the air, waiting, yet refusing to deliver him. And as his body dissolved into ruin, his mind sank deeper into darkness. Delirium seized him in the long nights. He cried out at shadows, raved against assassins that did not exist, and shouted orders for executions that could never be carried out. The servants who attended him lived in terror, for in his madness he remained a king, and his word, however wild, carried the weight of death. The man who once charmed Europe with wit and music now filled his palace with curses, each syllable dripping with rage and despair. But the collapse was not only of body and mind, it was spiritual. Henry, who had broken England from the Catholic Church, who had declared himself the supreme head of religion within his realm, now found no solace in God. Instead, he raged at heaven, cursing the divine power he once claimed to embody. The man who had fashioned himself as God's chosen instrument on earth now shook his fist at the very sky, demanding to know why he had been abandoned to this torment. It was the ultimate blasphemy, a king at war not with earthly foes, but with heaven itself. It was the early hours of January 28th, 1547, when the end finally came. At around 2 a.m, the man who had once commanded armies and toppled kingdoms slipped into silence. There was no majesty in his passing, no golden light, no heavenly triumph, only the groans of a body collapsing under the weight of its own corruption, and the muffled sobs of attendants who had watched their sovereign wither into something unrecognizable. The death of Henry VIII was not swift, not clean. It was the conclusion of a long, drawn-out battle between flesh and decay, in which the decay triumphed. But even in death, his body refused dignity. For days afterward, It was said the corruption within him continued its work. Chroniclers whispered that when his coffin was carried through the night, the pressure of gases and rot caused the wood to split, releasing a stream of putrid fluid that stained the inside of his bier. Some swore the coffin itself burst open, spilling the remains of the once mighty king in a grotesque display that seemed more like divine judgment than natural end. And yet, not all historians accept this tale. Some insist the story of the exploding coffin belongs to legend, a piece of dark folklore shaped by those who despised him. What is certain, however, is that the condition of his body was so foul, so corrupted, that even the undertakers tasked with preparing him recoiled in disgust. Fact or myth, the truth remains the same. Henry VIII left this world as he had lived his final years, wrapped in rot, horror, and fear. If you've watched this far, you clearly care about history's darkest truths. Subscribing costs nothing, but if you still won't, then you owe us an explanation in the comments. The death of Henry VIII lingers not as a tale of triumph, but as a warning carved into the very marrow of history. Here was a man who held unimaginable power, who bent a church to his will, who raised and destroyed queens, who commanded the lives of millions with a gesture. Yet no wealth, no throne, no army could shield him from the rebellion of his own flesh. His palaces could not silence the pain, his crowns could not mask the rot, and his proclamations could not halt the march of decay. In the end, Henry stands as a mirror for all who believe themselves untouchable. His body became the stage upon which mortality played its cruelest drama, reminding the world that kings and commoners alike must bow before the same fate. His tyranny brought him fear, but never love. His arrogance won him power, but denied him peace. What remains is a figure not of magnificence, but of monstrous decline, a lesson that pride and hubris always rot faster than the body. True power does not lie in domination, in conquest, or in the illusion of permanence. True power is found in humility, in compassion, in the legacy one leaves behind in the hearts of others. Henry VIII left a realm scarred by his appetites and terror. His life teaches us that the glory of a crown fades swiftly, but the mark of one's choices endures far beyond the grave. At Cave Tales Ancient History, we refuse to look away from the shadows that shaped our world. Here, we dig into the stories that history books soften or conceal, peeling back the gilded layers to expose the truth beneath. The death of Henry VIII is not just a tale of a single king. It is a reminder of what power, cruelty, and unchecked desire can do to any human life. These are the lessons buried in the past, and they deserve to be told without disguise. If you have walked with us this far, then join this community that dares to confront the darkness head-on. Like this video, subscribe, and stand with those who will not settle for polished lies. Add your voice, your thoughts, your questions, and become part of something larger, a gathering of those who understand that the past still speaks. Because if we do not face history's ugliest truths, we are doomed to repeat them.